Hi and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review of Babylon 5 Season 4 Part 1. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Babylon 5 one season at a time. For this video I'll be covering Season 4 of Babylon 5. However, those watching this video when it's first released may have noticed it's really late as I try to release my review for each season of Babylon 5 at the start of each month, and it's now more than halfway through the month. It was a combination of being really busy and the fact that I have so much to say about Season 4. In fact, this video was shaping up to be over 2 hours long, and as of this date I haven't even finished writing the script for the whole season. So I have decided to split Season 4 in half, so this video is part 1 of 2. I will try to release part 2 of my Season 4 coverage in about 2 weeks when I would have released my Season 5 review, and that is going to be pushed back for another month. So it will push back all my planned season by season reviews by 1 month, but I think that's what I need to do. In any event, this video I will give my overall thoughts on the season as a whole, and then cover up to episode 11 of this 22 episode season. And in part 2 I will cover the remaining 11 episodes and then give my score for the whole season plus my favorite and least favorite episodes of the season. And then in August I will continue with season 5 as per normal. I will put a link to part 2 of the season 4 review in the description below once it's released. So those watching this in the future won't have to worry about any of this. At any rate, let's get into the season. So in my Season 3 review, I talked about how there was a giant increase in quality from the previous seasons. And from recollection of when I watched the show before 10 years ago, I remember liking Season 4 even better. But when I first started this season, I was thinking, this isn't quite as good as I remember. In fact, I didn't think that much of Season 4 on this rewatch, at least for the first part of the season. It was still better than Seasons 1 and 2, but actually felt a bit subpar to Season 3. But that started to change in the middle of the season. By the end of the season, I can totally see why I remembered Season 4 as better, because the later half of Season 4 was absolutely amazing and the high point of Babylon 5, and no doubt why so many people consider this show a masterpiece, or for me anyway, it defies the difference between an okay but average sci-fi show to one of the greatest sci-fi shows of all time, which, watching the second half of Season 4, I can't help but think of Babylon 5 that way. Now, let me address the elephant in the room, and that is the fact that the storylines that take place in Season 4 were originally supposed to span 2 seasons. Because, as any Babylon 5 fan knows, Michael J. Straczynski's original plan for Babylon 5 was a 5-year plan that he thought out in detail. Although I would quibble with a lot of fans on how detailed this plan was, I don't think it was as detailed as many fans do, but that's neither here nor there. Point is, he had a 5-year plan that was going according to plan, more or less. That is until we got to Season 4, which at some point during the writing of Season 4, they were told the show was going to be canceled at the end of the season and would not be getting a Season 5. So JMS had to cram his planned remaining 2 years into 1 season so that they could finish his planned story by the end of Season 4. But as we all know, Babylon 5 did in fact get a Season 5 as it was picked up by TNT, so he could have actually stuck to the plan after all, but JMS didn't want to risk not being able to finish his story, and ultimately I can't blame him for that. But as it stands, Season 4 is a tad bit rushed, and Season 5 is pretty unnecessary, and is mostly just an epilogue after the main story, but I'll get to that when I get to Season 5, which is ultimately really hurt by this decision. And I kind of think that Season 5 shouldn't have happened at all, but again, I'll get to that later. As for Season 4, I think it was actually helped by this decision, particularly the second half of the season, because it gets right to the point. Doesn't have all the filler that all the previous seasons did. In fact, even Season 3, which I liked, had a lot of subpar and unnecessary episodes, where Season 4 didn't have any. Well, except for maybe one, but that episode existed just because of the change in the show getting picked up for Season 5, but I'll cover that in a later video. So, Season 4 really has two parts. It's first about resolving the Shadow War, and then about resolving the situation on Earth, which has been taken over by a ruthless dictator. And to be honest, I didn't really care that much for the Shadow War aspect of it. I mean, it was okay, but kind of bland. Whereas I absolutely loved how the Earth Rebellion storyline played out. In fact, I would say it's definitely the high point of the show. Now, regarding the Shadow War, I wasn't a fan of the direction it took this season. I thought the setup for it in Season 3 was fascinating, or Season 2 was fascinating, and the start of it in Season 3 was really engaging, but I kind of glazed over it here. And I don't like the turn that it takes. And I don't like what they did with the Vorlons. As before, they were always this mysterious helping hand race that was far advanced and superior to all other alien races seen in the show, even though they were mysterious, standoffish, and typically not that helpful. They always had the interests of humans and other races at heart. But here they twist that and turn them into another villain, where they are more obsessed with defeating the Shadows than they actually are of helping the aliens that the Shadows are harming. So that leads them to destroying any world that the Shadows have inhabited, regardless of how many innocent people they kill. And to me, that fundamentally changes the nature of the Vorlons as they have been portrayed on the show thus far. Now, I know I'll get a lot of people disagreeing with me on this and arguing that JMS had a 5-year plan, and surely this was part of the plan, that the Vorlons are always meant to be like this. Now, first off, you don't know that for sure. You don't know how specific his plan was, and secondly, even if it was in his plan, that doesn't change the fact that its execution was not handled particularly well and felt jarring. Now, I believe I mentioned before that I first watched Babylon 5 in like 2010, which was over a decade after it was released. So by the time I first saw Season 4, I had already seen Season 4 of Stargate Atlantis, and I couldn't help but draw comparisons between the two, so it felt like I had already seen this story before. To clarify, in Stargate Atlantis, throughout the show they've been dealing with the problem of an alien race known as the Wraith, who rule the galaxy and keep human populations sort of as cattle as they feed on humans from time to time. So every once in a while they'll show up in the world and just kill a whole bunch of them in order to feed on them. So they basically terrorize the whole galaxy and are a big problem for our heroes. In Season 4 of Atlantis, they have an encounter with an ancient race of artificially intelligent beings known as the Replicators, who were originally designed to hunt down and eliminate the Wraith, but had since abandoned that purpose. So our heroes reprogram the Replicators to make that their primary function, to hunt down the Wraith. But this backfires as the Replicators begin wiping out entire human populations in order to eliminate the Wraith's food source and thus damaging them. And so the Replicators end up becoming just as big of an issue as the Wraith. So I'm sure you see the similarities. Now, as I said, I will grant Babylon 5 came out nearly a decade before Stargate Atlantis, so if anyone was copying anyone, Stargate was clearly copying Babylon 5. That being said, I can't help that I had seen Stargate Atlantis first, therefore I felt like this was a bland storyline that I had already seen. But more to the point, regardless of which one I saw first, I thought in both cases the storyline did not work and came off as kind of a cop-out and a way to dull the story down and actually distances the audience from any involvement in this war story. And in both cases it felt forced and unnatural to the story. So it really doesn't matter which one I saw first, as even if I did see Babylon 5 first, when Stargate Atlantis came out, I would simply say, oh, I already saw this on Babylon 5, and it didn't work then, and it doesn't work now. It just so happens that when I saw Babylon 5, it reminded me of something that I don't like. Now, why don't I like it? First of all, I kind of lost interest in the Shadow War storyline after the third, season 3 two-parter, World Without an End, where Sheridan travels to the future and sees what happened, and that they were victorious in defeating the Shadows. And everything that happened since seemed to indicate this future will indeed come to pass, which to me kind of deflates the suspense element of the war storyline. Sure, we all know when watching a show like this that the villains aren't going to win and evil isn't going to triumph. In fact, if evil did triumph, I wouldn't like it. But knowing that intellectually is quite different from actually being shown the future where they clearly win the Shadow War. I know what's going to happen, so why do I care about this war? And further, the whole Vorlon involvement really changed the nature of the war in a way that disinterest and distanced me as it became about these two supernatural, superpowered beings fighting each other with technology so advanced it might as well be magic. Whereas what interested me about the Shadow War in Season 3 was the more personal element, the personal stakes with Sheridan, the risk he was taking, the involvement with his wife coming back from the dead to convince him to stop fighting. And that element was now gone. And it was about two fairyland superpowers doing shiny, super magical things, and it felt really bland to me. Now, that being said, I didn't totally hate the Shadow War storyline. It was still entertaining enough, and from what I remembered of it when I watched it 10 years ago, I didn't remember much of the Shadow War storyline in Season 4 other than I kind of glazed over it. And I kind of get the impression I wasn't paying full attention. So I tried to pay full attention this time, but could see why it was so forgettable. Being said, it still had its high points and some moments that were quite engaging. But to me, it wasn't until the season got back into the Earth Rebellion storyline that I was completely engaged. In fact, watching the show for a second time, I found this storyline far more engaging than I thought I would, or that I remember it being. It was kind of a slow build-up at first after the Shadow War had ended, but once it did kick in, not only did I love it, but it totally justified all the build-up, which helped cement this for me even more. So I remembered that the Earth Rebellion storyline was my favorite thing about Babylon 5, but I didn't remember just how excellent it was and just how much better it made the show overall. For example, it was my original plan to write this review while I watch each episode, so the idea was I'd watch an episode and then immediately write my segment about that one episode. And if I did do that, you'd be hearing about how much, in the first half of the season, how much I hated the storyline with Garibaldi and how contrived it felt, and that it's so out of character for him, and that to suddenly hate Sheridan and to quit his job and go on his own, and that is really bad storytelling. In fact, as I was watching this season, I was like, oh, I can't wait to do my review and talk about how shitty this whole Garibaldi storyline is. That is until the reveal. Once we got the reveal that it was Bester all along who had telepathically altered his personality in order to weed out a conspiracy on telepaths, I was just so blown away by this. I didn't even remember this from the first time I watched it, and in retrospect, it justifies everything Garibaldi has done and perfectly explains his behavior in a way I didn't think was possible. So it is incredibly impressive. As it turns out, what I thought was poorly written, contrived storyline, and then it makes me realize it was actually a well thought out, well structured, long-term story arc that was executed absolutely brilliantly. And one last important thing before I get into each episode, I am so thrilled that they brought back the classic Babylon 5 theme music for the opening sequence this year. They did tweak it a bit, but it works much better than the opening music for Season 3, which was just so generic. I love the Babylon 5 theme. It's one of its key signatures. That being said, the intro monologues where they have, a line from each character saying, "This is the year of fire, the year of rebirth, the year we took back what was ours," etc., etc. That was really cheesy, but I suppose not much more than any of the previous opening monologues. Anyway, let me now finally get into each episode, and we'll start with the season premiere, The Hour of the Wolf. Now, this episode took a bold direction that is not to feature Sheridan at all, as Season 3 ended with a cliffhanger of his death. And for most of the episode, they let you think that he was dead and show what it was like had he died. Now, intellectually, we all know he's not dead because the actor's name is still in the title. So we're not surprised when it's revealed at the end of the episode that he is in fact still alive. But we see Ivanova take over as the leader against the shadows, and I do really like that. I think it speaks a lot to her character. Of course, she does lead a mission to try to save Sheridan, but that, of course, doesn't go as well as she liked. And seeing Delenn having to deal with Sheridan's passing and accept it was also interesting. We also get the return of Mr. Morden in this episode. Now, historically, he's been one of my favorite characters, and I thought he did the slimy really well. But here, he's all made up and is has all this weird makeup on him because he survived Zahadum's destruction. So in this episode, he actually just comes off as silly to me, and I no longer find him interesting. But overall, the episode was kind of bland and a tad bit boring for a season premiere. I do think it was a poor follow-up to the excitement of Season 3's war and was a poor way to set up for the season. It also introduced us to the whole Londo on Centauri Prime storyline, but I'll get more into that in the next episode. Suffice to say, I was not a fan of it, particularly in this episode, and for the most part, this episode felt like it was spinning its wheels. So yeah, just a meh episode. So next episode we get to is Whatever Happened to Mr. Garibaldi, where the title suggests it deals with the disappearance of Garibaldi, as it wasn't only Sheridan who was missing in the Season 3 finale, but also Garibaldi. We do get a few quick scenes of Garibaldi, but it doesn't actually tell us what happened to Garibaldi, but it's the theme of the episode as G'Kar goes on a quest to find him, and other people wonder what happened to him. Now, as I alluded to earlier, had I written this review before I watched the entire season, I'd be talking now about how throwaway the thing with Garibaldi was, and it comes off as an afterthought and a waste of time. But knowing now what they did do with it and how they are perfectly tied this together, I no longer think that. But I didn't much care for the storyline of G'Kar leaving the safety of Babylon 5 to find Garibaldi, and he doesn't even have that many strong leads. We have gotten a few scenes of Garibaldi and G'Kar before, showing them as friends, but I just don't buy that their friendship was so strong that he'd be willing to risk his life over it, and so I don't buy it. It comes off as plot contrivancy to me, and the fact that he sent Marcus away after having a throwaway bar fight scene also felt pretty dumb and just there to advance the plot, because as it turns out, G'Kar does in fact get captured by the Centauri, whom he knows are actively looking for him, so it just goes to prove how stupid G'Kar was being. And when they bring him in front of the Emperor and he simply asks, "Oh, do you know where Mr. Garibaldi is?" That seems like a contrived way to tie it into the episode title, and I didn't really care for it. And now, let me get into this whole storyline with Londo on Centauri Prime. I didn't care for this, I'll be perfectly honest. I mentioned many times before that I don't really care for the Centauri. They come off as comically highly outdated and a bit ridiculous and cliched to me. I didn't care for this actor at all who played the Emperor. It just reminds me of a generic 80s soap opera actor. Now, I get the concept they were going for. This was an insane emperor or ruler who's lost his mind but yet still holds a lot of power, which is a historical thing. And I will say the way it works for the story does work really well overall. But again, as with most of the issues I have with Babylon 5, it comes down to its execution, which I really don't think works. I mean, the whole thing with him making an alliance with the Shadows because they promised him godhood, come on, I don't think that works. However, we also get more on Sheridan and his interactions with a Yoda wannabe who was one of the first ones named Lorien. He, of course, is named after Lothlorien from Lord of the Rings, which is an enchanted kingdom of magical elves led by an ancient and wise elf, Galadriel. And I would say this character does have a strong Lord of the Rings feel to it, perhaps a bit too strong for my taste. At any rate, I find these scenes boring for the most part. Again, it reminds me a lot of classic British sci-fi, the theatrical way in which it is staged. In fact, it does come off a lot like a stage play, which no doubt has a lot to do with JMS's background in theater, and I frankly find it kind of boring and wasn't really interested in overall. So again, another meh episode. So after that, we get The Summoning. Here we get the epic return of Sheridan, which I do think was played out pretty well. You had the plot of the League of Non-Allied Worlds threatening to withdraw their support from the Shadow War, as they seem to do a lot. But that being said, it does make sense of their characters that they are all a bunch of squabbling bureaucrats, and some of their concerns are indeed justified. Hestelin wants to organize them in one huge attack, which they think is a mistake, an act done out of grief from losing Sheridan. So when Sheridan appears at their protest and smacks them down for being morons, that was actually really cool. I did like that a lot. And then we also get the return of Garibaldi in this episode as Zack finds him on a ship that attacks them, but then it spits out a pod with Garibaldi and then the ship promptly explodes. So even when I first saw this episode, it was beyond obvious that whoever had Garibaldi simply gave them back Babylon 5 and then just destroyed any evidence that would have helped them. So it was beyond obvious that he was planted there. In fact, I think that Zack and the others were being really oblivious to the fact that there's very obviously something up with Garibaldi, and they try to treat him like nothing's wrong, which seems kind of stupid to me. And now, getting to the Centauri storyline, I have to point out that Veer is skinny now, which just doesn't sit right to me. I know people might criticize me for that. But, I mean, in the opening credits, they still use the older picture of him like they want him to be fat. But he's not anymore. He's actually looking kind of buff here, to be honest, and it just seems out of place. They probably should have put him in a fat suit, but whatever. Anywho, we got a plot of Londo agreeing to free Narn if G'Kar holds up his end of the bargain and helps him to overthrow the Emperor. The main issue with this, however, is for now, part of the deal entails enduring a lot of torture, which is no easy proposal. But even harder than enduring torture, Londo asks G'Kar to give up his pride, as Khadija wants G'Kar to scream or he'll kill him if he doesn't scream, and then he'd be useless to Londo's plan and useless to his people. I kind of see what they were going for here, but ultimately I don't think they got there. For one, I still can't get over the cheesiness of Cartagena as actor, but also I can't get behind G'Kar's insistence that simply screaming will somehow make him lose all honor or not be a real Narn anymore or anything like that. I mean, I understand G'Kar not wanting to give in one little bit to his captors and tormentors, but giving one little scream and he instantly loses all honor, I think that's more of a G'Kar problem, and he just needs to change his mindset. I know, I'm being unreasonable, blah, 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 and maybe I am, but I can't help but think that way, so I wasn't really that interested in this storyline, but that's just me. So next episode is Falling Towards Apotheosis. I probably pronounced that wrong, but I don't care. Where we deal more with the Vorlons destroying whole worlds in order to get to the shadows. Now, I already talked about how I wasn't that thrilled about this storyline, but more than that, I find it a cop-out to suddenly throw in the Vorlons and make them out to be just as harmful as the shadows were previously. They had always come off as a helping hand. A reluctant one, one that was never forthcoming, but still always on the good guy's side. Now all of a sudden they're obtuse and they want to eliminate the shadows at all costs, even if it means destroying whole worlds. I'm sorry, but that just feels silly to me. And the whole thing with Altesh and them having to come up with a plan to use Lita to get rid of him, that was cool. It was a high-tension scene that was really great to see. It had the Vorlons were basically become their enemies, and now they have to strive to get rid of them. I just have an underlying sense of apathy to this story, as I didn't like the whole idea of Altesh. And in fact, there wasn't more to him, and they basically just end up turning him into a mustache-twirling villain, and that doesn't interest me. And again, yeah. Not at all interested in this Centauri storyline. The whole thing with Cartagia talking to these heads of people he executed because he's crazy. Again, not interesting. So next episode is The Long Night. So this episode is the episode in which the First Men and the Children of the Forest band together to fight the White Walker invasion. Oh wait, sorry, wrong show. Okay, sorry, I had to throw that joke in. Okay, so no, this is the episode that is basically the penultimate episode of where we wrap up the storyline with Cartagia, and Londo manipulates him into going to Narn so that he can kill him and then deal with the Narns that they will benefit from. And so the whole time I kept thinking, wait, didn't they already do this storyline with Lord Reefer? They're just repeating what they've already done, and pretty much goes down like one would expect. Now, that being said, I did find the storyline engaging nonetheless, as it did have moments of pure tension when it appeared Londo's plan would fall apart, when Cartagia's madness appeared may throw them a curveball. And in fact, it doesn't go all according to plan, as Cartagia does catch on, and it ends up that Veer has to kill him. And I thought that was very satisfying. And as apathetic I am to the whole Vorlon shadow battle storyline, I still find what they did in this episode extremely engaging, as Sheridan had a huge gambit when faced with two unstoppable enemies. Of course, his ace in the hole is Lorien, who's not that interesting of a character and just seems to be there to recite cliches. But I found the stakes of his gambit and how he basically sent Ivanova and Marcus on a scouting mission to which they would likely not survive was very powerful. But even more powerful was the scene with Bryan Cranston. What? That's right, Bryan Cranston had a brief cameo on Babylon 5. I had completely forgotten about that. Anyway, he's really good in this role, as of course he is, because it's Bryan Cranston, where he's the commander of the White Star ship whom Sheridan has to order to his death for the greater good. And as I said, a really powerful scene, how Cranston basically had to console Sheridan and just say, yeah, we know our job, we are willing to give our lives, and that was really powerful stuff. So overall, this was a pretty good and exciting episode. So next we get Into the Fire, which does wrap up the whole Shadow of War storyline. So the Shadow War storyline is wrapped up after only 6 episodes in a 22 episode season. So that's just about like a quarter of the way through. Now, we don't know that this is the result of the show getting canceled after season 4. At least I don't, because I'm not sure when JMS found out. But my guess would be yes. That he did know, as it does seem really condensed. And in fact, the whole Vorlon battle to the death with the Shadows does seem a bit rushed. Not that I terribly mind that they got this storyline over with as soon as possible, because I was not a huge fan of it. But again, I'm not saying that this is a bad episode. In fact, I did really like this episode and thought it was a really intense way to end the Shadow War. Although I will say the whole scene with Delenn and Sheridan basically shaming the Shadows and Vorlons into going away was a tad bit silly. Kind of reminded me of a couple of episodes of Star Trek, the original series, but not in a good way. That being said, the other elements in this episode I thought really worked, particularly Lorian's involvement and how he was the wise one who was basically on a mission to collect all of these ancient beings so that they can move on and leave the galaxy to those now living in it. And you can see here probably most of all the Lord of the Rings influence in the story, as it very strongly resembles like the elves and Sauron and other ancient beings being defeated or leaving for the Undying Land so that men, the land of men and whatever, can take over. That being said, it does have a bit too much of a fantastical feel to it, which comes off a bit too grand to be relatable, which is perhaps why, even though I like this episode, I have to say I actually, even though I really liked this episode, it did have some sort of drawbacks. And I do have to say, I actually really like the Centauri storyline in this episode, as we see Londo take the leadership role and try to deal with the mess that Cartagia left behind. His first order of business is, of course, to get rid of the shadows so the Vorlons don't destroy their world, and also to deal with Mr. Morden now that he finally has the upper hand over him. But this situation is made more complex by the fact that Londo's intelligence chief tells him the truth that it wasn't Lord Reefer that ordered his lover's death, but it was Morden, and Morden basically played him for a fool. It was so great seeing this realization come to life, and the way Londo deals with it is so powerful. The scene we get where Londo confronts Morden was absolutely brilliant. I loved it to death, where Morden still has that slimy superior attitude, but Londo totally plays him here. First, by killing his shadow escorts, and then by blowing up the entire freaking island that the shadows were on. That was fucking brilliant. I absolutely loved it. And also getting the payoff with Veer getting to wave to Morden's head on the spike, just like he said he would several seasons ago, was cool. But the part about the Vorlons wanting to destroy Centauri Prime anyway, and Londo thinking that it was because that he was still alive, I was less impressed with. That being said, I do think it speaks a lot to Londo's character that he was instantly and without question willing to sacrifice himself just for the chance, just for the off chance that doing so might save his world. It was nice that we finally see who Londo really is without all the subterfuge. I did really like that. I don't absolutely love this episode and wouldn't say it is among the best that the show has ever done, but it's still a really good episode and a really satisfying way to end the Shadow War. So next episode is Epiphanies. So this episode starts to deal with the new dynamic after the Shadow War, and very naturally begins the slow process of focusing more on President Clark's storyline. Now I say beginning the slow process because it doesn't immediately switch to full focus to it, as this episode in particular has more to do with telepaths and the aftermath of the Shadow War, but it does start to set up that lets the audience know that the new focus now that the Shadow War is over is going to be on the Earth corruption storyline, which makes all the sense in the world, as this is a major lingering story thread that has been mostly ignored since the main two-parter in Season 3, but ignored for good reason because they were dealing with the Shadow War. But now that that's over, they can get back to this story. And I also did really like the way they slowly built up the conflict rather than jumping right into it, and they spent several episodes establishing this. I think this is part of what makes the storyline so effective. Now, my first thought was that it was a bit convenient that now that the show can focus more on Earth, that's when President Clark decides to put an embargo on Babylon 5. However, I do think this episode does adequately explain this when someone in the Earth government mentions that something has got President Clark suddenly spooked. This person doesn't know what that is, but we, the viewer, do, and that is the departure of the Shadows. As we know that the Clark government was supported by the Shadows, who helped put him into power because they knew that he'd leave them alone and let them do their thing. But with them gone, that makes him a lot more vulnerable, and moreover, I'm sure he's aware that Sheridan was the main man responsible for getting rid of them, so it makes total sense that he would turn his main attention to Sheridan, so I actually totally bought that explanation. Plus, it seems totally realistic to me that his attack doesn't come in the form of military strike, but an economic attack, which frankly is probably much more damaging than anything that he could do to them with an outright assault. As Sheridan has the backing of the Minbari as well as the White Star Fleet, so his best option is to attack him financially while simultaneously running a smear campaign against him. A very strong and effective propaganda campaign, which we get a bit more into in the next episode, but more into that when I get to that. But I really did like this, but the episode itself was mostly just moderately good. So next episode is The Illusion of Truth, and I really like this episode a lot, but at the same time I find it a bit frustrating to watch, as I love the prospect of a news team coming on Babylon 5 to do a story and then completely twisting the truth to serve a pro-Clark agenda, and it's propaganda that paints Sheridan in a negative light. The reason I find it so frustrating, though, has to do with how predictable this episode was, where it went exactly where you thought it was. As the whole time the reporters were on Babylon 5 and Sheridan was cooperating with them, thinking, oh, what's the worst they could do? It was so obvious that was an extremely naive attitude. In fact, in some instances it was like very obvious, in particular how their words would be twisted and used against them, such as when Sheridan was talking about his relationship with Delenn and was saying no one will stand in our way. It was so obvious that sentence would be used out of context in order to paint him as a villain. However, that being said, I did find this episode really powerful in its message of the power of propaganda, and that is a topic that's actually of great interest to me and one that I have studied in the past, in particular how it relates to modern day news. However, its depiction here was really simplistic and straightforward, as in modern times news is a lot more complex than simple propaganda piece depicted here. Where propaganda is a lot less obvious and more insidious, but it does make sense that an authoritarian dictatorship like the Clark administration would use simplistic propaganda like this because they can. Because they control all forms of information, so they are able to just bluntly lie and manipulate and twist people's words, and it is in fact a very effective tool because they control all information. We see examples like this in authoritarian societies that exist today in Asia, and that is really effective. So I do really like it, and I think it's realistic, and I thought the message here was really powerful, even though it was very predictable. In fact, I wish we got more follow-up on the propaganda side of the war later in the season, but this was probably cut when the remaining 2 seasons planned had to be crammed into 1 season. But I thought this was a pretty great episode. So next episode is Atonement, which on the surface, the premise is something that doesn't really appeal to me, as it focuses on the Minbari, and to be frank, I am not a huge fan of episodes that focus on the Minbari. This episode focuses on Delenn's clan calling her relationship with Sheridan, calling out her relationship with Sheridan, who is a human, and calling it into question and forcing her to forego some silly ritual where she remembers shit, and thus they have to have the show has an excuse to do some flashbacks and blah 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 blah, boring. But to my surprise, this episode actually gets really interesting, and during the flashbacks we see the build up to the big event, in which we heard about repeatedly throughout the show's run, where the humans and the Minbari made first contact, which went horribly wrong, leading to the death of their beloved leader, which then led to a war where the Minbari nearly wiped out all of humanity. But we see the Minbari's perspective on this for the first time, and this is interesting because we get get to see that this great leader whose name is Dukat, which I'm sorry I still can't get over, but even though I know Deep Space Nine likely ripped off Babylon 5 with that name, I know that's true, but it's still hard for me to look at this guy and see him as Dukat. I'm sorry. But anyway, it was interesting seeing Dukat put a lot of emphasis on meeting the humans, and he knew it was important. It kind of implied, but never stated outright, that he knew that their beloved Jesus figure Valen was in fact a human. And we know from past episodes that what provoked the humans to attack was that the Minbari approached with their gun ports open, which is a sign of respect in their culture, but of course the humans interpret this as a hostile gesture. But I love how Dukat actually didn't know that they were doing this and was smart enough to see that this was a stupid move and could be misinterpreted as a hostile act, and ordered them to stop immediately. But by this time it was too late, which was actually really interesting to see. But of course the main revelation is that after Dukat died, it was in fact Delenn who called for war, and to quote her, "show the humans no mercy." So this was a huge revelation. I did in fact think this informs her character more, and how she's been feeling this guilt over having rushed to war over grief without thinking things through. So the whole incident was just a barrage of misunderstanding, something Delenn now realizes and wants to put the past behind her as she plans to marry the human who killed the most Minbari during the war. But I think part of the reason she's able to forgive him so easily is because she knows her hands are bloody as well, arguably more so. So what I thought would be a boring episode actually ended up being a really interesting episode. Although I was less interested in the revelation that Delenn is a direct descendant to Valen, aka Sinclair, therefore her family already has human blood, and this dude was just trying to prevent the secret from coming out, so she was able to compromise with him, saying that she wouldn't tell anyone this as long as he stopped blocking their marriage. So yeah, that was fine. So overall, a pretty interesting episode. So the next episode we get is Racing Mars, and this is a pretty interesting episode, as Mars has been talked about a lot since season 1 and how it's struggling for independence, and we've gotten the spare brief scene taking place on Mars from time to time, but this is the first time we actually focus on it with the main characters going there, and I like that. It was also interesting that this signifies Sheridan starting to lay the groundwork for striking back at Clark, which is about time. But I like how instead of just striking out blindly, Sheridan goes about it in a lot more smart way, and that is by gathering intelligence and seeking out allies. Now, it's been established that Babylon 5 is in contact with other Earth colonies that had defected from President Clark's dictatorship, like Mars and Proxima 3, but it makes sense that Sheridan would actually want to send some officers there to see the situation firsthand, and I did enjoy these scenes with Marcus and Dr. Franklin traveling to Mars and how their mode of transport was less than comfortable. And I did like the introduction of the character of Captain Jack, who was their contact in the Mars underground but ends up betraying them. But we find out it's not because it's that he betrays them, because there's a weird alien parasite thingy on his shoulder, one of those things that we saw controlling Londo in the future and the Centauri region in the present. So one of those thingies is controlling him, and it was actually quite disturbing in a good way, the way that he knew that he was trapped, and even though they shot the thing off, he knew it would grow back, so the only way out was to kill himself. And so that was a very effectively creepy scene. And of course it was very clever the way that he was trying to tip the others off that he wasn't really himself by dropping inconsistencies that didn't make sense. So this storyline really worked. It made a lot of sense. But on Babylon 5, we get Sheridan confronting Garibaldi after Garibaldi spoke out publicly against him for the Clark propaganda piece. Now, I think Sheridan was being more than fair, as he was just confused by Garibaldi's sudden change in behavior, as well he should be, because it doesn't make any sense. And so instead of being mad at him for betraying him, which he had every right to be, instead he reaches out to see if there's any way that he can mend the fences. But all he manages to do is actually making things worse and pissing him off even more, which leads Garibaldi to joining these goons who actively want to sabotage Sheridan. And after Garibaldi punches Sheridan, he very rightfully says, "Fine, that is it. I had enough of your BS. If you ever hit me like this again, I will rip your head off." And I think that is more than fair, because it was obviously beyond obvious that Garibaldi was being completely unreasonable, and his claims that Sheridan is an egomaniac figure who believes that he's the best thing since sliced bread has no validity whatsoever. And as I said, had I not known the twist, I would likely call this bad writing and say that there's no way anyone could be this obtuse. But then again, knowing the twist, it actually does make perfect sense. Also, in this episode, we see how Babylon 5 deals with the trade war President Clark is waging against them, as we get a scene of Ivanova basically manipulating black market smugglers into helping them acquire supplies. And that was a pretty great scene, I must say. So overall, a really good episode. So after that, we get Lines of Communication, an episode that admittedly was very meh. I did get the impression from this episode that perhaps at this stage JMS actually wasn't aware that Babylon 5 was getting canceled at the end of the season, so was setting the stage for that Season 5, theoretical Season 5 that never existed, by introducing a new bad guy, the Drock. And in fact, the Drock did become a major enemy in what was Season 5, but I did get the impression at this stage they had something different planned for them. And to be fair, I wasn't very impressed with them, and they came off as just bland, bad guys. And this episode in particular was quite bland. We did get some scenes back on Mars where Franklin devoted more of established more of a relationship with the resistance leader referred to as Number 1, and tried to convince them not to set off bombs because killing civilians is not the way to go, which was a really interesting storyline. So it saves this episode from totally sucking, but the episode is still not particularly interesting, so just meh. So that's it for part 1 of my review of Babylon 5 Season 4. As I said, I will be back in the beginning of July for part 2 of my coverage of Babylon 5 Season 4, while I'll get more into the second half of the season, which in my opinion is Babylon 5 at its best. So be sure to keep an eye out for that, as well as many other videos I do for many other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.